All right, now for our prayer today, I'm reading from Isaiah 58, chapters, verses 7 through 10. And this will be our prayer for the day. Is the Lord's command not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. Amen. So since I'm a preacher at heart, I can never shake off preaching. If you've been with me for these weeks, you know that this crazy pastor can't shake off preaching. Even when I teach, I have these homiletic moments, which are really, I know for some of you, might be so annoying. My kids are annoyed by them sometimes, even in my parenting. But one of the interesting things about the text today, if you notice, that I love, is that the text forces us to think about something. And that is, if we're busy doing justice, then we don't have to worry very much about the things we worry so much about. The bickering and the, all the divisions that we have in our society, in our world, in our life, those are not so important if we focus on justice, which I think is fascinating, something for us to kind of think about as we go forward. So that's just, again, that's the homiletic moment for this moment. Can promise that I won't break into preaching through our time together today. All right. So we've been discussing together these practices of justice. And in the first week, we talked about the practices around love, and they were love, loving kindness, dignity, affirmation, and solidarity. Week 1. Week 2, they were all hypothetically practices around community, hospitality, friendship, and reconciliation, peace building. So those as week 2. And now we're in the 3rd week. Now, this week is interesting because you could say that the one theme among these is kind of the inner life of the follower of Jesus. And the practice we're going to talk together around is our Sabbath, simplicity, what I'm calling mindfulness, and then mutual service. Sabbath, simplicity, mindfulness, and mutual service. And those are kind of the wrapping up of the 12 practices of justice that I wanted us to discuss together. And so now this is a kind of a little bit of a hodgepodge of them. Again, I'm going to work on these and maybe write a white paper on these, but let's keep them as 12 right now. So we're going to start with Sabbath as practice. And here I'm so thankful for another great book in my collection of things that everyone should read. It's by Abraham Joshua Heschel, called The Sabbath. One of the great books on Sabbath. Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the great rabbis and Old Testament Hebrew teachers and professors and scholars. And one of the things he says in this book, and I want to share with you, is that Sabbath, he believes, is not something that should be an addition to our lives. But he says, he actually has very strong words about this. He says that Sabbath is important in order for civilization to survive. That's a big word, right? Survive. And he says, gallantly, ceaselessly, quietly, man must fight for inner liberty to remain independent of the enslavement of the material world. Inner liberty depends upon being exempt from domination of things, as well as from domination of people. There are many who have acquired a high degree of political and social liberty, but only a few who are not enslaved to things. This is our constant problem: how to live with people and remain free, how to live with things and remain independent. And so Sabbath, he says, emphasizes that sanctification is dependent upon human behavior and attitude. Sanctifying the Sabbath is part of imitation of God. but it's also a way to find God's presence. So Sabbath as a practice actually liberates us, frees us from the constant push within our souls to be producers of things. Sabbath frees us, liberates us from the constant pressures of society for all of us to be makers of things, producers of things. Now, folks, I don't have to tell this group that, do I? I think all of us have lived long enough to recognize that we live in a culture that is constantly obsessed with production, with doing more, and where we actually put so much emphasis on it that it's almost like the dignity of the other becomes dependent upon how much you produce. What kind of good do you do in the world? Whatever good. And that good is based on a system that's directly related to consumption, right? That is just part of how the Western world has been built. And so that reality that's all around us. And then in Protestantism, we have the so-called Protestant work ethic, which is not actually very Christian at all. But it has been so defining in the Western imagination, especially in North America, that it just really drives so much of our lives. I cannot tell you how much psychotherapeutic money I've spent trying to free myself from the voice that tells me that I'm only worthy the more I produce. And so Sabbath should be the practice, if we practice it, that it's a weekly pause in order for us to remember that we're not producers, that that's not our value. I'm thankful for a theologian whose name I cannot remember now, I read his book recently on art and making, and he talks about we're not producers, we are the makers. Humans are makers, and the importance of the distinction between the two. We are indeed creators, and so part of Sabbathing is making room for that creative spirit that's part of humanity, right? And I don't know about you, so I'm a church geek, and honestly, if it wasn't, in so many ways, my spouse and my children have been helpful in my own sanctification, in the sense that living life with them and over these years together, and my spouse and I have been married for almost 20 years now, and we've been together for almost 23 years. So we've lived long enough together where her influence in me was what's really valuable in my life, because within my bones, because of my early upbringing, if it wasn't for them, I would live and breathe and sleep and eat inside the building called the church, right? If I was left to my own devices, I would actually, my whole life would be enmeshed in this pastoral life, which, by the way, as one who's seasonally made that mistake, it's not healthy for the church, and it's not healthy for the human who's pastor. But I'm just talking about pastor. I don't know. I am sure that I'm not alone. I'm sure if you're a physician or a basket weaver or a teacher or whatever you are, all of us in American society can actually could get to a place where we're obsessed with that. So Sabbathing introduces us into a different reality. If you go to the Old Testament, if you go to the very boring books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, really cool, geeky stuff though, one of the things you realize is that Sabbath is the personal idea of Sabbath, the ceasing of production that God did according to Jewish tradition on the seventh day of creation, which, by the way, should it fascinate us in American society that God Sabbathed and we seem to refuse to Sabbath? Should that kind of capture our own imagination that God said that God needed rest and we act as if we don't? Something that has kind of caught my imagination too. But I digress. Sabbath is not just something that we personally do. If you read Deuteronomy and Leviticus or Numbers, you realize Sabbath actually is a whole pattern in all of creation, right? So the day goes into night, for example. Animals hibernate for certain seasons, depending on the animal. In order for the fields to be truly fruitful, they have to lay fallow for a season. So you cannot use and expect them to always produce. And actually, the whole Sabbath thing was a call for all of creation to get reordered, right? So part of that pattern was a pattern of economics, which most North Americans would totally hate, because the economics of the Old Testament are not capitalist. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And so that pattern was woven into the economics of early Israelite society, and began to ask of some Sabbathing, including the Sabbathing against debt. So every 50 years, in the year of Jubilee, you would have the forgiveness of debt and the restoration of all land, so the original owner. Because you remember that the Israelites were given the land in equal parts across the promised land, except for the Levites, who had to live out of a portion from each tribe. And anyways, right, you see how this worked, right? It was a whole system that called for the Sabbathing. So here's the thing. If we don't, so Sabbath is justice. The practice of Sabbath is practice of justice. And so imagine us as a community, if we're justice seekers, not just to practice Sabbath for ourselves, but demand that all humans have an opportunity for Sabbath. It cannot be that Sabbath is a luxury. And if you're a shift worker, Sabbath is a luxury. If you're a minimum wage worker, I don't know in Nebraska, I think I said this to you a few weeks ago, but I know in Louisiana, you have to work over 60 hours a week just to be able to afford for a single person to be able to live above the poverty line and be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment in the state of Louisiana. Over 60 hours a week, just for one. Forget how much you had to work if you had a child or you had a dependent mother or father. I mean, that would just, you're talking now in the 70 to 80 hour a week kind of range. Or think about, recently there's been a lot of conversation about family leave and those kind of things. And in the United States, we're, I think, the only industrialized nation that doesn't have some kind of family leave as part of our laws. So imagine when something like family leave, like let's say a person having a baby, that being a luxury, because who could afford to be out for more than a few days if you cannot work and you don't get paid? So I think, so Sabbath as justice is not just our own practice of it personally, which we should model it, and not model it and then look at it like, well, I'm glad our pastor is Sabbathing, but shouldn't they be working? You know, aren't we paying them? Right? Because our society does that, right? Our society kind of, we might smile and go, oh, that's a good sermon on Sabbath, Pastor Juan, but I just want to make sure you're earning your keep. I had a person long ago in a church who would watch my car, see if my car was in the parking lot of the church. And if my car was in the parking lot when they drove by the church around between 7:30 and 8 in the morning, he would call the church, no matter what the day of the week was, to see where I was, make sure I was at work, because I was getting paid to be at work. I didn't realize I was getting paid to get at work 24/7, but apparently this person didn't understand that. But again, that those are the patterns that we have in our society that seems like it's an endless cycle of work, which is just a fascinating thing. And so practicing Sabbath is practicing justice, and we should encourage it not just for ourselves, but also for neighbor. Now, would that require some sacrifices on all of our parts? Yep, sure will. But remember that these practices are all very complex and difficult. Would that require some adjustments about the way we do life together? Absolutely, it does. It will. It just demands it. So in some ways, the Sabbath practice might force some of the other ones that we've been talking, might force some hospitality conversations, Might force some neighboring conversations. Might force some conversations around solidarity and love. I mean, it just might, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So that's Sabbath for us. And again, if you want to know more, Abraham Heschel is one of the best at that piece. Now I want to talk about the second practice in this kind of cohort, which I call mindfulness, but that's a tricky term. Because for me, what this term, the way I'm using it, it's a series of practices that are part of an inner life around being present, around presence, around self-awareness, and around discernment. So what I'm kind of putting together under this one category of mindfulness, which has become kind of a little bit of a hot word in today's talk around spirituality. It's really a word that includes, again, being fully present to each moment, but also discernment, being able to discern the best way forward in light of our commitment to the good news of Jesus Christ, and then self-awareness. And so I'm going to talk about those three to kind of help see if you can, if something clicks within you around these things. So self-awareness is a recognition. Part of it is a recognition that the way you put your world together is not, it's just the way you put your world together. It's not that way. It's not normative for everyone else. And that each person, each one of us has a different way of putting our world together. That also includes perspectives, right? So my opinions and my perspectives are just that, are my opinions and my perspectives. Now, some of us have opinions that are more educated than others. For example, as much as I love to talk about ethics, I'm not an ethicist. So if an ethicist was here in the group, then I would want them to speak more, in a more educated way about that. And as I've told you before, my arena of expertise is very tiny compared to most of you, right? I have a very tight level of expertise. This pastor has been spending all his academic career and endeavors has been spent on theology and biblical studies in that kind of arena, preaching, that kind of thing. So my expertise is narrow. Some of y'all have much broader expertise, and that's beautiful and wonderful. And so we need each other. But self-awareness is that kind of understanding and recognition that where our limits are in our life and in our story. That also is an awareness of our own story and the reality that we have different stories, and our stories shape us in deep ways. And so I think part of this conversation together in the way we practice justice in a mindful way is a certain humility that comes from that self-awareness. And that self-awareness requires a constant check-in. For me, in my own life with God, part of that self-awareness check-in comes from my spiritual director. So I meet with her once a month, and that's a moment where we have an opportunity to have a partner in my life with God. Sometimes those conversations are beautiful and amazing and wonderful, and some of those conversations are really hard and real. But he helps me kind of become aware of those patterns in my head and in my heart that might keep me from being fully present with other people, which reminds me of presence as a practice. And this is one that I have a really tough time with, and I've had to practice and practice and practice. And that is that being mindful is not just being self-aware, but it's being fully present to that moment. The reality of it is that we only have today. Today's all we've got. We don't have tomorrow. Yesterday's gone. And so how can we be here in this moment that we have together and be with one another in a way that honors this time together, and listen to one another and recognize one another's humanity? And especially when things get really difficult, right? When conversations get heated or when we have disagreements, it's even more important that we kind of lean on presence. Yeah. And what does it mean for me to be embodied in this body of mine? What are the limits of that embodiment? That's practicing presence. That also means recognizing where we are in the middle of the day, right? So like I told you, I'm a morning person. I'm a sharper thinker and talker and being present when it's between 8 and noon, much better than I am between 6 and 10, right? So we're in the middle of Pastor One's getting tired, not ready to be in bed with my pajamas on, right? So being present, there's an awareness, an inner awareness, and then discernment in this like cluster comes out of this presence and out of this self-awareness. We begin to ask the question within ourselves, in light of who I claim to be, in light of the values that I claim to hold, how do I behave in the world? What is the next faithful place to be, the next faithful step? It's a question, especially in disagreement, but not just in disagreement. It's also a question when we have decisions to make, right? What is best here? What are we discerning together is the most faithful to the good news of Jesus Christ, to love in its fullest way. In my own life, in the last 6, I came from Louisiana to Lincoln, Nebraska, and part of this process was a discernment process. And for me, when I gathered that group and I followed a pattern called the Clearness Committee of the Quaker tradition, and there were 5 people who joined me on Zoom, people who knew me from across my life. He was led by an elder in the church, not just in terms of his credentialing as a United Methodist, but also in terms of age. He was a retired pastor in his 70s. He's seen a heck of a lot more life and ministry than I ever had. And he had been a companion of mine about 10 years before, through a time of professional development. So he knew my work extremely well. He's seen psychological assessments about me. He's seen 360 reports from my direct reports. He had read reports, about my personality. So he had this kind of interesting view of who I was. And he led this group in a series of questions that helped me discern, is God's invitation for you to go to Lincoln, Nebraska and live your ministry there? Is that God's invitation, or is that just something that one wants to do? Or is that something that one doesn't want to do, but it's still God's invitation? And so discernment in our lives can take different layers, but I believe that these 3 together lead us into a practice of mindfulness and being self-aware, discerning, and present in that cluster allows us to be a people of more deeper justice, because we are more rooted people. We're a more centered people. I would say actually that this cluster is key to being a disciple of Jesus, right? So I could actually take it out of just the practice of justice thing and just say, this is so important just to be a follower of Jesus. So just kind of keep on thinking about that. The next practice is simplicity. And for that one, I'm actually going to go to one of my favorite teachers around simplicity is Richard Foster, who wrote a book that really has shaped my life in deep ways called Celebration of Discipline. I'm sure some of you have read it. It's a classic. I mean, I think every follower of Jesus should read it. And Richard Foster is a Quaker from the Quaker tradition, and he wrote a short chapter on this that I want to kind of make you aware of. But simplicity is a key practice of life with God, and yet it's a practice that it's so important. He says, Richard Foster says, simplicity is freedom. Duplicity is bondage. Simplicity brings joy and balance. Duplicity brings anxiety and fear. So simplicity, again, is to think about letting go of the things we really truly don't need and being aware of the cravings of our soul. Dr. Jim Keck this week talked a little bit about this, like, what do you want, right? So simplicity calls us to really consider what it looks like to get rid of all that really gets in the way of our being fully human and gets in the way of us engaging in solidarity with the other. Now, this is a practice that's very difficult in a society that actually asks us to kind of calls us to coveting and to hoarding. It's like you will never have enough. I laugh about this time of the year. I laugh every year because I don't know if you've seen them. I'm sure you have. All the commercials about buying a car for Christmas, and I still don't know who gets cars for Christmas. Like I've never met a person who got a car for Christmas or bought one for Christmas. That's cool if you do, no judgment here. But I'm going like, my gosh, really? Like car for Christmas? My gosh, I can barely think about a simple gift. That's no stocking stuffer, but it's all a trick, normalizing you on Christmas morning, walking out your door and there's snow falling and there's a big car with a bow on it. Normalizing that, first of all, it's ridiculous, right? Let's get real. That's ridiculous. But number two, it kind of makes what you were going to give a little puny. You might not give a car for Christmas, but all of a sudden you're up in the ante a bit, wondering if the book you thought about giving or the $25 gift card to a favorite place to eat. Oh my gosh, that looks like nothing now that I've seen the car advertisement. So simplicity calls us to actually kind of question the values that tell us those things, and begins to help us hopefully clear ourselves from that kind of feeling of bondage to getting more things. One of the humbling practices for me as a pastor around simplicity has happened every time that I have moved. So, I've been a United Methodist elder for 16 years, and we moved. And I have pastored 5 churches in 16 years. So about every 3 years, right? I did 3, then 5, then 2, right? So all of a sudden you're finding out you have to move. And guess what? You have a very tight budget for moves across the conference. So you have to assess whether you want to move that, whatever it is, to the next place, especially books, which are I have trouble with them. Let's just say that. Yeah, books. Yeah, I'm not alone. I can see that. Yeah. But you begin to assess that. You begin to assess, like you go, oh my goodness, do I want to pay money to get this moved? Like I haven't even. So 2 moves ago, I found a box in a back room of the house that we hadn't even opened in 3 years. So in other words, we moved it from the previous place. We packed it in Baton Rouge when we lived there. At some point, we packed it when we were in it. But then we moved to Shreveport, and in 3 years, we never opened it. So we had a decision to make. Do we open it? Do we leave it as it is and move it? Or do we just give it to Goodwill? Well, we opened it because then the whole thing is, do I have something like important documents in there? Your mind starts playing trick. Honestly, it was some kind of general kitchen crap box. Obviously, we didn't miss any of the utensils that were there and the things. And if we did, I guess we bought more, right? I mean, it was still closed. But it was always quite humbling when we packed the car with stuff for Goodwill. And we packed the curb with trash. And so simplicity hopefully allows us to begin to think, look around, and make an assessment of how we're living right now. Are there things we no longer need? Maybe someone else needs those things. Or before, when I go to Target, and my joke around my house, I don't know if this happens to you, but in my house, I think I'm just going to start sending Target about $200 a month, just sending it to them with the promise that I just won't drive by their store anymore. All I'm going to do is just send it. You can have it. You can have the $200 because I think it's costing me more when my family actually goes there. So it's assessing those patterns and wondering, when you pick it up, do I really need this book? I think I need it. If it's a book, I always think I need it. Or whatever it is, piece of clothing, tool, gadget, I don't know, latest appliance or latest electronic thing. Did you realize that iPhones are over $1,000 now? I mean, that's crazy, right? And yet I have one, and I'm just embarrassed to admit it, but I have one of those $1,000 iPhones that I'm carrying around. And I'm like, what? That is crazy. So it's assessing. And I think the practice of justice, as a practice of justice, it also helps us recognize how blessed we are, right? And maybe it will push us to make sure that others can experience the bounty that we might experience. And then the last practice for the day, and then we'll go into kind of questions and conversation. And this is another one of those I'm calling it mutual service. This is one of them that might change in the next iteration of this. Mutual service. And what I mean by this one is an attitude of care and service to the other human. An attitude of care and service to the other human. Not just to the human we like, or not just to the human we live with. And by extension, care and service, mutual service to creation itself. So it's a two-pronged thing. It's mutual service. So I'm going to say this real quickly. We are interdependent upon one another. That's actually what justice is really about, right? At its cornerstone, a recognition of our interdependence. That interdependence means that there are seasons of life, where we have to, where some of us need more care than the others, right? And when we live in a society that's so bent on individualism, then this is a lot harder to even think about. So we need one another, but we all don't need one another in the same way, at the same rate. So let me give you a personal example. So there's 2 humans here in this house that I live in, which there's 5 of us. There's 3 children, although they are all teenagers. And as I try to tell my oldest, who's almost 18, I know, hard to believe, I don't look like a father of a soon-to-be 18-year-old, right? The older you are, the more responsibility you have as part of this community that we call our family. It's an ecology. It's an ecological system, right? But anyways, so there's 2 adult humans, right? And there's seasons when one of us human has had to care for the other human in more active ways. There's seasons when work has not been the same. So in the last 2 years, when I was in Homa, my work was more flexible and it was less stressful than my spouse's. So I took on more responsibilities, in the house. And then the vice versa has happened. There were seasons when my work has been more stressful and taking more time and less flexible, right? There are times when one of us is sick and the other one's healthy, right? So then you have this shifting that happens. And so the same thing happens in our relationships to our neighbors, to our community. And by extension, too, this also applies to our creation care, right? Which is that our interdependence and our mutual service is not just to other humans, which we already have difficulty with, by the way, but also is to creation itself, right? Creation gives to us, but we're really bad at giving back to creation. We're actually terrible at it, if we're honest, right? Part of that theological piece around Sabbath that I told you about in the Protestant work ethic has been really killer for our care for creation, because he talked about dominion as a way to actually exploit instead of being in an interdependent relationship with. By the way, we also exploited people. That's exactly why we had the transatlantic slave trade. That's exactly why we had indigenous people in America, died, and we genocide, I mean, it's all around the idea of, oh, I'm a human, I have dominion over you, so guess what? You're destroyed and I'm good. So this interdependent thinking, this mutual service, is a recognition of our interdependence and the ebbs and flow of that interdependence. And so being attentive to that interdependence into mutual service is key to doing justice. Our neighbor might just need extra pair of hands, or an extra $100 a month, or an extra $200 a month. The earth might need extra tending and extra Sabbathing. That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to be a people of justice. It means that we care for one another in this beautiful creation of ours. And so we must begin to ask the question, how are we living that out in our sphere of influence? Whatever that is, what are our closest kinship ties, and how are we living that balance out? Are we always the receivers of care? Are we always the givers of care? How are we doing together? And as we assess this reality, it begins to give us, again, that helps us grow in self-awareness. That helps us grow in solidarity. So some of this actually helps the other practices grow in us. And the reality of it is, in my experience, has been that when I've really come alongside another and served them without any strings attached, something is transformed in me. Something is transformed in me. When I love the other as if they were Jesus, right? Isn't that what Jesus told us? When you see this other, you see me. That does something within me. It transforms me. When I do something, or when I care for the wildlife in this earth, or for the ground that I step on each day, when I pay attention to it, something changes in me too. So part of the practice of mutual service actually opens our hearts to the interconnection. And sometimes that means that we have to kind of fake it till we make it type of thing. Excuse me. For some of us, this doesn't come as easy. For some of us, it's difficult to be service givers. For some of us, it's difficult to be service receivers. It's that constant kind of like, I can do it on my own. I still remember about, I want to say a decade ago, my father had back surgery, a pretty serious surgery. My father had lung and heart issues. And so his surgeon said, this is very difficult surgery, and you have all these other issues. And so I recommend that your family comes in and sees you, because we don't know how the surgery is going to go. So I traveled from Louisiana to Virginia, where my father was. And he went through surgery, okay. And the first night, my mother stayed with my father. Not a big deal. Well, it was a very long night because my father is a pitiful patient. Pitiful, the worst. So for the second night, I said, hey, mother, I traveled over from Louisiana. I tell you what, I'll stay the night. And she was like, no. I said, no, mother, I'll do it. I'll stay the night. So, here's me and my dad. And my dad, again, he's a terrible, horrible patient. And he needed to go to the bathroom. Again, this is not a big deal. This is part of life. We all need to go to the bathroom, right? So I said, okay, Dad, need to go? Let's go. Oh, no, I'll just sit here and wait a little longer because I don't want to bother you. Like, excuse me, what? Like, if you didn't want to bother me, I'm here from Louisiana. Like, I would have been bothered already, And so my father and I had an actual argument. He got smart ass with me and even tried to pull the dad card. I'm like, excuse me, Dad, don't be an asshole. Don't be pulling the dad card on me. I love you. And I want to help you. Let me love you and help you. Well, he at that point, tears came to his eyes. He was feeling vulnerable, right? He was feeling vulnerable. He was grieving his independence that he loved so much. And I said, Dad, the best thing you can do, if you want to be independent, is to let me help you. Because imagine if you try to get up and then you fall. Then we're going to have bigger problems, right? So guess what? Father and son, son won for the first time ever. By the way, can I just take credit for that for the first time? Because my father's a very difficult person. So son won. But again, honestly, serving my dad in that way was such a gift. Because no matter how difficult he'd been, because he'd been difficult, he was still my dad and I loved him. And can I also tell y'all, it's just almost a testimony that moment changed our relationship in a powerful way. Because he also realized that his son that he raised had enough heart and compassion to come alongside him and even argue with him when he was being hard-headed and still love him and still laugh. And so again, when we serve others, and sometimes those most proximate to us, it changes us and it changes the other. And it creates connections in a particular way. And the same applies when we connect with the earth. When we mutually serve this earth, by the way, this is the only earth we have. This is the earth that we've been given by the divine life. And so that also something happens when we do that, that really transforms us and transforms the earth that we serve. So Sabbath, practice it and encourage it and strengthen it. Simplicity, assess, not with guilt and shame. No one's going to look at your hoarding tendencies tonight. All we're going to ask you is to assess and to ask questions the next time you go into the. Remember that we live in an economy, which is a fascinating thing in American society, but our economy is actually dependent on you consuming things. That's a whole nother conversation. I'm with you, Penny. I'm with you. It is really, it's a huge problem. We have a significant problem in our economic model. We don't like to talk about it and we get angry, but we need to recognize that actually the basis of our economic model is unsustainable, actually. And that's a whole nother talk. I mean, we could actually do a whole series of conversations on what we might call biblical economics. Might not be very popular of a study, but it might be something to help people kind of see things differently. So anyway, simplicity, also ask that question. Do I need to be always a consumer? And the answer to that is no, you don't. But that's that. Again, think about that. Mindfulness is an invitation to your inner life, but it's really not just about being present. It is. It's about discernment, and it's about self-awareness. Those patterns within your soul. And remember too that that one almost really requires a companion or companions. Who's your conversation partner in this work? For me, over the years, my spiritual director, once a month for the last 20 years or so. It's been a long time now. But also seasons of psychotherapy, right? So I've had these seasons where I've sat with a psychotherapist, and not only when things go bad or when I struggle, but really even in times when things are better and I just need another person to kind of help me become more self-aware. That's been very helpful. And then the last one's mutual service, which we've talked about, and it's about a certain awareness of our interdependence and our willingness to not just be a caregiver, but also our willingness to be a care receiver. And depending on your personality, some of us are better at one or the other. It's a more holistic look at this. And that, remember that includes the earth. So it's not just mutual service as human to human, but it's mutual service in the ecology of creation as a whole. Well, folks, we have about 10 minutes, maybe 12, give or take. Any thoughts, any questions? Again, we're playing with these ideas. This is, Juan Carlos is not an expert on the 12 practices of justice. I just put 12 practices as a conversation for us. Any thoughts or any questions or something? What's something that struck you today in our conversation?
Well, whenever I hear about Sabbath, two things come to mind. I had a wonderful, wonderful person who went all over our neighborhood and put out a little card on all of our doors that he would clean for people. Well, who's this? We all get stuff like that. Well, so I couldn't check him out. He was an individual. Well, one time I was going to have a party, and as usual, too much clutter, and I didn't have a lot of time to clean it all up. So I thought, well, hey, I got that card. So I found it miraculously and called him. And there began an unbelievable friendship. He was a student at Union College, and he absolutely rigorously kept the Sabbath every week, no questions asked. as an example, I invited him. He was a wonderful guy, worked so hard as a cleaning person, loved it. Loved cleaning, friends, loved it. A guy, okay? His grandmother had taught him as a child. So he was doing what his loving relative, his grandmother, often a special bond with any of us, had taught him. I mean, he would do stuff like put alcohol, wipe the phone with alcohol. What? I mean, I never heard of some of this stuff. He was so thorough and he loved doing it. One time, he just hadn't been to that many classical concerts. And I was, not Yitzhak Rabin, sorry, that's the Israeli prime minister. Yitzhak Perlman, I think, the violinist, I think that's his last name. But anyway, he was in Lincoln and I was able to get tickets. It was on a Friday night. And so I invited him and he said, oh, I don't know, that I guess I could. It is a wonderful renewing experience. But I needed to give him a check after dark. And he couldn't, he really had to struggle with little behaviors because for him, the Sabbath was so separate. And I've often thought about it. I could have a Sabbath, all of us could. But what might we share at First-Plymouth or amongst some group so it could really be meaningful? Because it was such a meaningful tradition. So that really knocked me off my block. I just, I can talk about it and think about it and read the Bible about it. And I joined a wonderful Sojourners Sabbath economics group recently, which is a whole nother topic. Great group. Anyway, what do you guys think about Sabbath like that? And it really challenges me whenever I think of Matthew.
Penny, I love you because Sabbath, if you look at the Hebrew people, it is a communal practice.
Right.
It's a shared practice in that community. So it has this dimension of it. Right. That I think in American society it's almost countercultural. So it's not just the idea of Sabbath that's kind of cultural. It's the idea of this kind of engagement with neighbor, where you cease producing and you kind of gather and feast, right? Because Shabbat starts actually with a meal. So yeah, that's interesting. Anyone else on that Sabbath thing or anything else that's kind of struck you today?
I recently met a gentleman who's a theory about, he was almost 100 years old and he was looking back over the world's changes over his lifespan. And he believed with all of his heart that some of the negativity and the changes that have been not going so well in our world and our society recently all began when stores started to open on Sundays, when commerce started to when the society as a whole put money and progress and commerce ahead of Sundays, family time, church time, rest time. He said people like to say it's the internet, people like to say it's this or it's that, but really it all started before that. The slide started when we gave up our Sundays. I've been thinking about that since then, and I think there's, some merit to give that thought. I'm not sure we'll ever get society to go back, but I remember Sundays being free of, you can't go to the store on Sunday. And we did just fine without this trip to the store on Sunday. So just a thought.
I like Walter Brueggemann, and he talks about Sabbath quite a bit. And one of the books that he had is Sabbath as Resistance. And he talks of the point that we've been discussing here tonight, is that by conceptualizing Sabbath as a time when we pull back from the hurriedness of the day, as you said, Juan Carlos, production, and take that time to say, no, I'm stepping off the spinning wheel here. This is my time to be quiet. I find that very, very powerful, and it's not something that I do very easily. I'm still a struggling consumer on all that I do. And the notion that we can engage in the Sabbath as a way of practice of justice, or justice practice, where we can resist the temptation to continue to be part of this repetitive cycle that captures us and captures our children in our society.
A few churches ago, well, in the last 2 churches that I've served, maybe 3, we as a community have done some work on Sabbath, and one of the decisions we made, which were at the time were a little controversial, but in the end were powerful. We decided that, first of all, really thinking about how the staff uses their time and making sure that they were Sabbathing, right? How could we encourage our church staff to practice Sabbathing? The second is we took Sabbath from administrative meetings in the month of July and the month of December. July was a typical month for vacations and things like that. December, of course, is the holiday season. And we feel like if we cannot pause from these administrative matters, basically just one meeting in July, right? Normally they met once a month. So one meeting in July, one meeting in December, then what are we doing? You know, like if we can't seize. And so we encourage the leaders to take that time to build community. So if you were going to take that time for that hour and a half for a meeting, go and spend that time, invite people over to your house and have dinner together. See what I'm saying? Like encourage them to a practice of community building. Go and engage somebody you've never met, right? Go sit in a porch somewhere. And we invited them again to engage in community during that time. Now, of course, I'm not Big Brother. I couldn't monitor what they did with their hour and a half that they got back in December and July. But over the years that I pastored, you know, in those 3 years that I was there, I actually saw they began to just kind of look forward to that July, into that December, to that pausing that you did. And so I think sometimes you start with little things and you encourage then the alternative practice. It will be hard for us to say, we're going to have Sabbath, like Seventh-day Adventists. I mean, that's part of their church kind of law and their church life. And that's their identity, you know? The same thing with Jewish communities in the United States. I mean, everything ceases. It's just what happens. And if you live in communities where they have Orthodox Jewish communities, I remember in Atlanta, Georgia, when I lived there, you know, you saw people walking to Shabbat. You know, they wouldn't even drive their vehicles on Shabbat. And so you have this support, but in places like ours, you might start very small. You might start with a group who says, we're going to practice Sabbath in community together. So yeah, anything else before we go today? We have a few minutes left. Anything else that catches your attention that you're going to carry with you into the future?
I just appreciate all of the themes that we have been talking, you know, these 3 weeks. And I like it very much because we actually can do it in our day-to-day lives. It's not, you know, like I love peace and justice, but I always think, you know, what can I do? Like just one individual, you know, I don't have a lots of money and stuff like that. So you're always waiting for the right opportunity to show, and that's never going to happen. You know, like all of the conditions perfect. You have the time, you have the money. So I love this. And this pandemic has taught me that this is the time. I mean, if it's not now, when? So I love the fact that this little practices can help so much in that, you know, like inner life, that contemplation before the action, like Father Richard Rohr says, you know, you have to keep that inner peace that gives you the peace and the calm and the humility and being able to go out there and do the things that you want to do. So I appreciate that very much, Juan Carlos. Those are really, really good practices.
Thank you so much. It's been a blessing. You know, when you have something in your head for a while, it's been floating in your head, and then you put it on paper, and then you write a little bit about it, and you study a little bit about it, and then you kind of go, oh, you know, I wonder what this is like. And then you throw it at a Bible study like I did a few months ago now. And then someone like Addie comes in and says, hey, you want to do a 3 weeks thing on something? I'm like, oh, I have this crazy idea thing that I would love to tease out. So it's thank you for being you've been like a little test group for this kind of crazy idea. And I want to leave you tonight with some wisdom from my abuela. My abuela was grandmother was a single mom, a woman who struggled deeply in ways unimaginable what she went through in her life. She lived to be 94. She raised 5 children on her own, and in a very abusive situation. And she would say something when you would tell her, and this is very common in Latin America, I think too. She would say, I'm really like in the mid, I am screwed. I'm not well, pero estoy en la lucha. I'm in the struggle. En la lucha. I'm in the struggle. And I've always remembered that. You know, that she always, no matter how difficult it was, and this woman went through enough heartache to write a book, but she was always in the struggle and always encouraged us. You know, if you called her for wisdom, she would say, mijo, tú estás en la lucha, sigue en la lucha, continue in the struggle, right? And so I invite you to, no matter how difficult it gets or complex it gets or hard it looks, or justice actually is hard, but I invite you to continue in the struggle, continue in la lucha, because in the end, it is that lucha, that struggle. And I wish I had a whole class to tell you about that. That concept in Latin American theology is actually much larger than this. I'm just giving you a little taste. That idea is, in the end, as we were hearing, it's what will keep us from saying, well, it's just too big of a thing, I just can't do anything about it. Right? Just stay in it and try it, test it, attempt it, connect, stay in the struggle, stay in la lucha. And I believe the Holy Spirit in the end will guide us then out of that struggle into little seeds of justice, just seeds of justice that we just sow seeds. Even if we never quite see them, our sowing will bear fruit in the end. That's the promise of the Holy Spirit. That just is. And I'm thankful for you for these seasons. All right, folks, we're going to close up. I do invite you, if you have an idea, or if you want to learn something more, or if you want me to speak about a theme, just send me a note, because we're already planning for 2022. And you know, Addie is an amazing human who likes to plan ahead. I am too. So we're already putting some plans together for the spring of 2022. So if there's something you say, oh, Juan Carlos, why don't you talk to us about whatever, then send me an email and we'll put it on our board and see how it fits. Because really, I believe that the best ideas for preaching and teaching come from God's people, not from me. So send me a note and say, hey, what about this? And I would love to see what we come up with. The same thing, if this is helpful, you know, part of our evaluation now is how much of Zoom we do versus in person, right? Like many other communities, we're beginning to ask that question. How much in Zoom, how much in person, how much of both? And so if you think, hey, I would commit to a Zoom thing, then let us know that too. Say, hey, I would commit to a Zoom thing, because that allows us to plan for 2022 in helpful ways. You are a gifted community, a blessing to my life, and I'm thankful to be one of your pastors. Let's stay with it, because God is faithful. And our way of life is needed in Lincoln and beyond. Good night, folks. See you soon. Bye-bye.